She stood barefoot on polished stone, the echo of her anklets betraying her trembling. A eunuch had woken her at dusk, no words, only a nod, and now she was being led through corridors lined with silence. She had no idea where she was going, but in the Forbidden City, there was only one place a girl was taken at this hour. Tonight, the Emperor had summoned her. She was 13. Her name had been erased the day she entered the palace. Since then, she had been known only by her title, a number in a ranked list of women, all waiting to be touched, noticed, used. She had spent years in preparation, bathing rituals, calligraphy drills, lessons in how to kneel, how to speak, how to lower her eyes without appearing cold. The eunuchs taught her silence. The older concubines taught her fear. She remembered how proud her father looked when imperial officials took her from the village. He called it an honor, a chance for the family to rise. Her mother cried in private but said nothing. Women never said anything, not when their daughters were given away like dowry coins, not when their husbands kissed the feet of the throne. The girl had never seen the emperor before, not clearly, only from a distance, a shadow behind silk curtains, a voice behind folding screens. Now she would be in his chamber, alone, and she did not know what to do. They had dressed her in the softest silk, painted her face white with red lips, rubbed her skin with jasmine oil. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She looked like someone's idea of beauty, but not a child, and not herself. As the doors to the bedchamber opened, the incense hit her first, thick, sweet, almost choking. The room was dimly lit by candlelight. Gold patterns shimmered on the silk drapes that hung around the massive bed in the center. Two eunuchs guided her forward, then vanished behind her. The door closed. He was waiting, silent. She knelt, bowed, waited. She had been told not to speak unless spoken to, not to resist, not to flinch. What happened next was between her and the emperor, and the gods. That night she became one of the many women who shared his bed, but not his heart, not his favor, not even his memory. She would not return to her dormitory that night. She would be taken to another wing, one reserved for those who had been touched. Her rank would be reviewed, her behavior assessed, her body inspected. She was no longer a girl, but she was not a woman either. She was something else now, property wrapped in perfume. In the Forbidden City, love was an illusion, consent was irrelevant, and survival depended not on beauty, but on silence. She had no name, no voice, no choices, and no escape. She was born female, and that was her first crime. Before a girl could be summoned to the emperor's bed, she had to be chosen, not by him, but by the machine of power that surrounded him. In imperial China, beauty was not a blessing. It was a curse that marked a girl for inspection. Every few years, the Forbidden City conducted what was known as the Elegant Women Selection, a process to replenish the harem. Officials were dispatched across provinces, searching for young girls between the ages of 9 and 14. Families received letters, some felt pride, others dread. But refusal wasn't an option. Once selected, a daughter became imperial property. Girls were taken from their homes and brought to the capital in caravans, some in ornate carriages, others in wooden carts. Nobility and commoners alike offered their daughters to the throne, hoping for status, favor, or survival. Fathers bowed as their children were inspected like livestock. Mothers held their tears until the gates shut. At the Forbidden City gates, the evaluation began. First came the physical inspection. Officials checked for any defects. Crooked teeth, scars, birthmarks, or blemishes could disqualify a girl. Skin was examined under sunlight. Nails, hair, posture, even body odor. Nothing was too small. Eunuchs noted breast development, hip shape, and complexion. Then came the behavioral tests. Girls were asked to kneel, walk, pour tea, and remain still. Silence was crucial. Timid, obedient, and blank-faced. That's what they wanted. A girl with too much curiosity was a risk. A girl who cried was weak. A girl who asked questions was dangerous. Their virginity was not assumed, it was inspected. Senior palace matrons, often under the gaze of eunuchs, conducted crude physical checks. These were invasive, painful, and humiliating, but necessary, they said, to preserve the purity of the emperor's harem. The virgin body was sacred, but only because it hadn't yet belonged to the Son of Heaven. The girls who passed were ranked, not by name, but by title. Elegant lady, worthy woman, pure attendant. Each title denoted their place in the hierarchy. and their future access to the emperor. Most would never rise above their assigned rank. Many would never even be seen again by the outside world. From that moment on, their previous identity was erased. They were no longer daughters, sisters, or human beings. They became numbers in a bureaucratic inventory, classified under the Bureau of Concubines like furniture in a palace storeroom. Their names were replaced with character titles, their birthdays rewritten by court astrologers, their dialects erased through forced Mandarin training. In a matter of weeks, a child from rural Sichuan or a merchant's daughter from Guangdong was molded into a palace shadow. Families were forbidden to contact them. If the emperor never called their name, they would never see their parents. Some wrote letters in secret, most were never delivered. The ones who wept at night were silenced by elder concubines, the ones who resisted were beaten by eunuchs, the ones who spoke of escape disappeared. Some concubines came from noble bloodlines, daughters of generals or scholars, offered to the throne as part of political alliances, but even they were reduced to flesh. No title, no family, no education could protect a woman once she stepped behind the silk curtain of the harem. It wasn't just their bodies that were inspected, it was their entire sense of self. The emperor, it was said, deserved only the finest, but what they really meant was the most obedient. Many girls believed being chosen was an honor. They didn't realize that entering the palace meant they would never leave again. In theory, these girls could rise in rank, even become noble consorts, or in rare cases, empress. But in practice, for every one woman who ascended the hierarchy, dozens aged out of favor, their bodies fading into memory long before their names were even spoken. And yet families continued to offer their daughters, some out of ambition, others out of desperation, and many because they had no choice. In the imperial system, a woman's body was currency, and the emperor was the only one allowed to spend it. What happened next depended not on love, merit, or destiny, but on one man's desire and her ability to survive it. The Forbidden City did not raise girls, it engineered them. Once selected, the new concubines were not simply left to wander the palace. They were immediately placed into training programs, rigid, silent, and psychological. Their purpose to become fit for the bed of the emperor, known by all as the Son of Heaven. This wasn't education, it was transformation. Every movement, every glance, every breath were to be molded. First came the rules. They were forbidden from initiating speech, forbidden from making eye contact unless spoken to, forbidden from expressing desire, pain, or fear. Emotion was dangerous. Individuality was deadly. The palace tutors, older concubines who had survived long enough to teach, were rarely kind. They had lived through the same conditioning and now passed it on like ritual. Their cruelty wasn't always personal. In this system, silence and submission were the tools of survival. Compassion was a liability. New concubines were taught to walk silently across stone floors without disturbing the emperor's rest. They learned to kneel with grace, to bow with precision, to smile with serenity even in fear. They memorized long lists of palace ranks, rituals, and proper greetings. They were drilled in tea service, embroidery, classical music, and dance. Not for their own fulfillment, but to create an atmosphere of delicate, decorative obedience. But the most sacred lessons were those surrounding the emperor's bed. The phrase used was, to serve the dragon. And the dragon, they were told, must never be disturbed. Girls were instructed in sexual etiquette, how to disrobe without being asked, how to wait naked without trembling, how to conceal discomfort beneath layers of ritual grace. There were rules on where to lie on the bed, which side to face, which hand to use to support themselves even. The way they were to moan was regulated, soft, elegant, not too loud, for the emperor's comfort. Some girls were trained by eunuchs who explained the physical expectations with clinical detachment. Others were observed by older concubines who gave brutal corrections. You smile too much. It looks like seduction. You're too stiff. He'll think you fear him. You looked into his eyes. Never do that again. The goal was not pleasure. It was readiness. To become a vessel the emperor could use, without complaint, without resistance, and without lingering presence once he was done. The irony was thus, while the emperor had near mythical power over life and death, he was also deeply paranoid. He believed his spirit could be disturbed by improper touch, his energy drained by a woman who lacked discipline. Therefore, every act around his body, sexual or not, had to follow strict ritual codes. A single wrong movement during intimacy could result in demotion, or worse. So the girls practiced, not for love but for survival. There were myths in the palace, whispers about what happened to girls who failed to please. Some said they were transferred to the laundry halls, a polite exile. Others said they were given to eunuchs as punishment, a darker, unspeakable fate. No one ever confirmed the stories, but the fear was enough. The concubines did not compete in beauty alone. They competed in compliance. And yet, behind closed doors, many suffered in silence. Night terrors, self-inflicted injuries, nervous tics hidden behind perfect posture. The stress of constant scrutiny broke some of them long before they ever touched the emperor's bed. And what made it worse, the emperor often forgot them after a single night. But they could never forget him, because once a girl had served the dragon, she could never be touched by another man. She could never leave the palace. She was spiritually and legally branded, forever part of the emperor's flesh. The Forbidden City had no walls taller than the ones it built inside its women, and the greatest cruelty, most of them still dreamed of being chosen. Because for all the pain and fear, to be touched was to be seen. And for many concubines, invisibility was worse than anything. She had done everything right, learned to walk without sound, smile without desire, kneel without shaking. For months, sometimes years, she had been preparing. Now she waited. Every evening, the concubines of the Forbidden City gathered in silence, perfectly dressed, perfectly painted, sitting like porcelain figures in the hall of mental cultivation. None spoke, none dared move too much. Because at any moment the emperor's chief eunuch would appear and point to one. That was how it happened. A finger, a nod, a name called. No warning, no pattern. Sometimes he wanted the same girl 5 nights in a row. Sometimes he forgot them forever. He did not owe explanations. The selected concubine would be escorted by eunuchs to bathe. Her body would be scrubbed, hair perfumed, skin oiled. She would be examined again, to ensure she carried no poison, no weapon, no disease. Then she would be wrapped in thin robes and carried, literally lifted, to the emperor's chambers. Why carried? Because according to imperial superstition, the emperor's women must not walk to his bed, their feet must not touch the ground. It was said that walking brought earthly dust and earthly thoughts into his sacred space. Once inside, she would wait beside the silk sheets. The emperor might appear quickly, or he might make her wait for hours. Sometimes he came drunk, sometimes distracted, sometimes not at all. And still, she waited. Every gesture had been practiced, every breath calculated. She would undress without being asked, position herself according to protocol, speak only if spoken to, respond to pain with silence, respond to dismissal with a bow. In those long nights, a single wrong gesture could determine her fate for years. If he was pleased, she might be summoned again, perhaps promoted, perhaps remembered. If not, she might spend the rest of her life in obscurity, or worse, demoted to one of the inner halls, never to be summoned again. But being forgotten wasn't the worst fate. Being remembered could be worse. If she bore him a son, she might become powerful. But if she bore him a son and the child died, she could be accused of sabotage. If she showed too much affection, she might be labeled manipulative. If she showed too little, she might be accused of coldness. There was no winning, only surviving. Some concubines began to fake sickness to avoid being summoned. Others bribed eunuchs to place them further down the call list. A few even harmed themselves, just enough to be considered temporarily unfit. Because for some, waiting beside those silk sheets wasn't opportunity, it was terror. The bed was not a symbol of intimacy, it was a battlefield, and women were not lovers, they were weapons, used and discarded by dynastic politics. The emperor's touch could elevate a concubine to the second highest woman in the empire, or it could doom her to a life of whispered rumors and hidden shame. And in the shadows of the bedchamber where history could not see, countless women waited, some with hope, some with fear, all with no control over what came next. In the Forbidden City, the most dangerous place to be was close to the emperor. In the hierarchy of the Forbidden City, even After. A woman had been touched by the emperor. She was not safe. She was ranked. She was measured. And she was judged. Not by her intelligence, not by her character, but by her usefulness to the throne. Each concubine was assigned a formal rank by the imperial harem bureau. There were 9 tiers. At the very top stood the song empress, beneath her the Kong, noble consorts, and below them, a long line of nameless women with titles like pure lady, worthy attendant, talented woman. Each title dictated how much food she received, what rooms she slept in, how many servants she commanded, and even how many candles were allowed to burn in her chamber. It was a cold, mathematical system. Your worth could rise or vanish based on a single night. Some women were touched once and never again. The emperor forgot them. They became ornaments and shadows in the imperial records. They lived out their lives in silence, fading from youth into invisibility. Others rose quickly. A concubine who bore a son could leap ranks, sometimes higher than noble-born rivals. But that rise came with danger, because power bred jealousy. And the higher a woman climbed, the more enemies she made. The Forbidden City was not a sisterhood. It was a cage of rival queens. Each woman taught to distrust the others, each trying to be the last one remembered. They fought not with knives, but with whispers. Poisoned powder hidden in cosmetics. Fabric soaked in slow toxins. False accusations made to eunuchs and whispered through court corridors. If a concubine was suspected of conspiring, even without evidence, she could be demoted, beaten, or banished to the cold palace, a dark, unlit wing of the city where women were sent to disappear. Some spent decades there, forgotten by name, their minds unraveling in silence. For the women who had fallen from favor, life was no longer about rank, it was about endurance. They still wore fine robes, but only in private. They still performed rituals, but no longer for anyone who listened. Their status was a ghost, their beauty a memory. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to leave, forbidden to love. Even their own children, if they had any, were raised by wet nurses and court tutors. Seen only from afar, in tightly controlled moments of ceremony, the bond between mother and child was secondary to the emperor's control over the bloodline. For some, that separation broke them more than anything. The emperor had thousands of women in his harem, but could only remember a handful. The rest were forgotten pages, in a book no one read. And yet, every year, new girls arrived, new faces, new names, new dreams. And the old ones, they sat behind curtains, stared out at the courtyards where they once waited, listened to the silk rustle of younger women being summoned, just as they once were. They had been used, ranked, and now they were forgotten. The Forbidden City was not merely a palace, it was a battlefield. But here the war wasn't fought with swords, it was fought with jealousy. Every woman in the harem knew affection was power, and power could mean survival. So when one concubine gained the emperor's favor, the others took notice. When she received better food, a higher allowance, or new silk garments, they envied her. When she bore a child, especially a son, they feared her. And when she rose too quickly, they plotted. Whispers became rumors, rumors became accusations, and accusations could kill. Jealousy in the harem was not petty emotion, it was political instinct. Because once a woman gained too much influence, she threatened the balance. Her child might rise to become crown prince, her family might gain unprecedented court access, and every other woman's future could be crushed beneath that ascendancy. That's why women poisoned each other, not just with arsenic, but with gossip. A single whispered claim that a concubine had cursed the emperor or used love potions or brought bad omens could lead to an investigation. And in the Forbidden City, an investigation was often a death sentence. The empress herself was not immune. Many times, the empress and higher-ranking consorts led secret coalitions to eliminate their rivals. One famous case tells of one consort Zhao, who rose rapidly through the ranks after giving birth to a son the emperor adored. Jealous rivals accused her of practicing witchcraft. They bribed eunuchs to plant talismans beneath her bed, symbols of forbidden black magic. She was interred, regated, beaten, stripped of rank. Her child was taken, and she was sent to the cold palace, where she died alone, raving from isolation. And what was her real crime? She had been loved too much. Some concubines were mutilated, others drowned in palace ponds, their deaths recorded as accidents. Some were forced to commit suicide, given silk ropes or poisoned wine in the name of imperial honor. A few vanished entirely. No tomb, no name, no trace. But the most haunting violence wasn't always physical, it was psychological. Concubines were trapped in a system that made them both victim and aggressor. They were taught to smile at women they hated, to praise women they envied, to destroy women who looked too much like themselves. The palace encouraged this, because a divided harem was a controlled harem. The emperor ruled more easily when the women fought among themselves. Sisterhood was broken before it could ever form. Some tried to build alliances. A few shared secrets in whispers, but trust was rare, and betrayal was common. Even a look could be dangerous. If a concubine was seen gazing too long at the emperor, others might report her for seduction. If she looked away too quickly, she could be accused of contempt. There was no correct expression, only consequences, and jealousy didn't always come from rivals. Sometimes it came from Hamtu, the emperor himself. A woman who spoke too cleverly, who had too many opinions, or who reminded him too much of a former love, could be punished out of insecurity. One emperor is said to have executed a concubine after she reminded him of a lost empress he mourned too deeply. Another burned the letters of a favorite woman after learning she had once been in love before entering the palace. The palace trained women to erase themselves, yet punished them for being too empty. It wanted perfection, yet crushed those who stood out. In this environment, jealousy wasn't an emotion, it was a past survival strategy. A knife that cut both ways. And in the quiet corners of the palace, long after the emperor's footsteps faded down the corridor, the concubines wept. Not just for what they'd lost, but for what they'd done to each other just to stay alive. In the Forbidden City, a woman could be executed not for disobedience, but for touching the emperor the wrong way. The irony was devastating. Concubines were summoned to serve the emperor's body. They were trained to bring him pleasure, warmth, loyalty. And yet, that same closeness could destroy them. Because while the emperor had the right to touch, use, and discard any woman he pleased, she, in return, had no right to touch him. Not without permission, not with affection, not with familiarity, to brush his hand too gently, to linger with a gaze, to speak when not addressed. These were not gestures of love, they were violations, sometimes interpreted as attempts to bewitch or control the emperor. In imperial ideology, the emperor's body was sacred, the vessel of heaven's mandate. To touch it improperly was sacrilege. To influence it emotionally was sedition, and the price of sacrilege was blood. Countless stories survive of concubines who were punished or killed for the smallest breaches of ritual. Some knelt too close. Some looked into the emperor's eyes too long. Some cried during intimacy, a reminder of their humanity the emperor did not want to see. Some were accused of speaking to eunuchs about the emperor's habits, a capital offense. The punishments were often symbolic. A woman might be stripped of her fine clothes and made to sweep the palace floors, or her hair, the symbol of femininity, might be cut. Sometimes she was flogged, sometimes confined to a windowless room, forced to chant apologies for days. In extreme cases, she was given the silk rope, an imperial order to end her own life. And what made it crueler, the rules were invisible. They changed with each emperor, with his mood, with his paranoia, with his political needs. One ruler might favor gentle concubines who wept in his arms. Another might see tears as manipulation and banish them. There was no guidebook, no certainty, only risk. And yet touching the emperor was unavoidable. His body, godlike to some, terrifying to others, was the axis around which the concubines' lives turned. To be called to his bed was both an honor and a sentence. To please him could mean survival. To displease him, and even by accident, could mean ruin. And for some women it was even worse, because they were chosen not out of desire, but out of duty. When omens were bad, or when illness swept the palace, the emperor was told to restore his vitality by sleeping with certain types of women, usually virgins or concubines born under auspicious signs. They were chosen as all medicine. Their value wasn't in who they were, it was in what they were believed to cure. These women, once used, were often discarded or died in childbirth, their bodies taxed beyond what youth could bear. Others went mad from the contradiction, trained to serve, then punished for being too close. taught to surrender, then condemned for trying to connect. They became shells, quiet, obedient, hollow. They smiled at banquets. They bowed in rituals. They sang, they danced, they bled. But inside, they were drowning. Because they learned the cruelest truth of all. To touch the emperor was to vanish. Their names were erased from records, their stories buried beneath marble floors, their lives reduced to a line in a eunuch's ledger. And yet, some resisted. A few concubines left behind poems carved into fans or embroidered into pillow linings, hidden messages that survived centuries. One reads, "He touched my body, but never saw me. I gave him silk. He left me silence." A quiet rebellion, a final voice from within the cage. They were punished for touching him. But history has remembered their touch, far longer than any ever did. She was called a concubine, but that word meant nothing outside the palace. To the emperor, she was a body. To the court, she was a rank. To the eunuchs, a duty. To history, often not even a name. But to herself, what was she? What did it mean to share his bed? It meant to surrender before you were old enough to understand the cost. It meant being chosen, not for love or even beauty, but for your silence, your obedience, your ability to disappear when the night was over. It meant being trained to please, but punished for wanting. To serve the whims of a man you might see once, or 100 times, and never truly know. It meant becoming a wild symbol of imperial glory, a walking piece of dynasty, while being stripped of your own family, your own freedom, your own future. Because once you shared his bed, you belonged to no one else. You could never remarry, you could not return to your village, you could not walk through a market or speak to a stranger or write your own history. You existed only within his shadow. And what if you loved him? Some did. Some believed that the emperor, despite his distance, his power, his cruelty, might see them, understand them, choose them again. And sometimes he did, for a week, a month, until another face appeared, another name was called. Then love became grief, and grief became silence. For others, the emperor was not a man, but a god to survive. They shared his bed the way a soldier survives a war, by bracing for pain and praying for morning. And when morning came, they waited, to be summoned again, to be remembered, or to be forgotten. Because even the forgotten concubines were still his. Their lives remained bound to the rules of the harem, even as they aged, even as their beauty faded, even as the emperor died and a new one took his place. There were women in the palace who had served 3 emperors. They lived in quiet wings, shadows among shadows, no longer summoned, no longer seen. They stitched embroidery, recited prayers, watched the changing of the guard. They remembered the nights, they remembered the fear, they remembered the warmth of silk sheets that never felt like home. And they remembered the other girls, the ones who never returned from the emperor's bed, the ones whose names were erased, the ones who bled too much, the ones who broke. So what did it mean, truly, to share his bed? It meant to be found close to power, yet completely powerless, to hold the empire's future in your womb, and yet be denied your own destiny, to be worshipped as beauty, yet never loved as a person, to survive in golden prisons, silenced by etiquette, ranked by fertility, erased by fear. It meant to be a woman, in a world that never saw you as human, and still, they endured. Some found moments of joy in poetry, music, stolen glances across courtyards. Some raised sons who would one day wear the crown. Some protected each other in small acts of defiance, a shared pastry, a hidden letter, a whispered prayer. And some, despite it all, dared to write. To leave behind fragments of themselves, a verse sewn into silk, a memory inked into bamboo, a name scratched beneath paint. They could not escape the system, but they refused to vanish. Today, we walk through the ruins of their palaces. We read imperial records, gaze at portraits, marvel at architecture, but behind all that glory, there were women. Women who were taken young, trained to kneel, forced to smile, used in rituals, in politics, in beds they could never call their own. This is what it meant to share his bed. It meant giving everything, and often receiving nothing in return, not even remembrance. But now, we remember them.